Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our first virtual College of Liberal Arts faculty colloquium of the fall 2022 semester. My name, Dr. Quentin Maynard. I will be the moderator for today's talk and the rest of the talks this semester and next semester. Before we begin, I'd like to just make a few comments. As some of you heard, we're recording this session and live streaming it to Facebook. So if you're watching this at a later date, hello. And if you're on Facebook, hello again. If you have any questions for the speaker, please type them in the Q&A box and we'll address your questions during the question and answer session at the end of this presentation. If we have any students in the audience who wish to receive extra credit for attending today's talk, please send me a message via the chat, stating your name, your professor's name, and the course for which you'd like to receive this credit. Before I introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Denise Lynn, I'd like to welcome Dean Del Dowdy, who began as the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts this academic year, and I'd like to invite him to say a few words before we begin this year's colloquium series. Dean Dowdy, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Happy Friday afternoon, everybody. This is a great way to end a Friday, kind of setting various things aside and listening to Professor Lynn's talk. I'm excited for this event because I'm interested in the topic, but I'm going to say excited because other people are excited. Now, I don't know if that's the best reason to be excited about something, but I think if you're new to the community, as I am, this is the first time for a student to attend this event. I guess the reason for the excitement would be that what we're about to do gets really close to the heart of what we love doing in the academy, and that is coming together. That's important. Before someone who has some expertise in an area and has maybe done some fresh original research, she's going to share with us, and then we will engage with her. So that's what a colloquium is. It differs in my mind from a lecture. A lecture, you show up and the expert broadcasts information, and there may be some Q&A. But a colloquium tells me mentally that expectations are a little different here. We, the attendees, are not here just to passively absorb information, but to engage and to bring something ourselves to the discussion that will follow the talk. So I hope that's why we're excited. So I hope that you kind of feel that and you enjoy it and return for other colloquia throughout the year, because they're all wonderful opportunities to get in front of an expert and engage and come away smarter. So thank you, Dr. Maynard, and back to you.
All right, well, thank you for your time, Dean Dowdy. And without further delay, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, the reason everyone is here, Dr. Denise Lynn. So Denise Lynn is a professor of history and director of gender and Africana studies at the University of Southern Indiana here in Evansville. Originally from upstate New York, she attended SUNY Binghamton State University of New York, where she received her MA and PhD. Her research focuses on women in the American Communist Party. Dr. Lynn is the vice president of the Historians of American Communism and the editor of its journal, American Communist History. She has written a regular blog for Black Perspectives and has written for Nursing Clio, Marxist Sociology, and Lawrence and Wishart. Her articles have appeared in American Communist History, Women's History Review, Journal of Cold War Studies, Radical Americas, and Journal for the Study of Radicalism. Dr. Lynn is the author of Where is Juliet Stewart Points? Gender, Spycraft, and American Anti-Stalinism in the Early Cold War from the University of Massachusetts Press. Her current book project is on radical Black women in the anti-Korean War movement and a biography of Claudia Jones. Dr. Lynn, the screen and our virtual floor is yours.
All right, thank you. I want to thank Quentin for organizing this, and I, of course, want to thank Carolyn Zulo, who is our tech guru here in the College of Liberal Arts, and thank you everyone for coming. I'm going to try to be mindful of my time so that we have time to chat at the end of this. I want to first say that this is the basis of my 6th chapter in my book on the anti-Korean War movement. If you're like, I didn't even know there was an anti-Korean War movement, part of the reason is what I'm going to be talking about today, the official harassment of people involved in the movement. So if you pay attention to the news, people on the political right have been deploying the accusation of socialism and communism against groups and individuals as diverse as Joe Biden to Black Lives Matter. This is an old tool that has been used for over 150 years to try and discredit claims to social justice. This is a quote from Gerald Horne, who is a historian. Quote, the definition of communism, which could be as diverse as being against Jim Crow for recognition of the government in Peking or against the war in Korea, was tailored not coincidentally to sweep within its ambit just about everyone who was not conservative. The peace movement after World War II opposed military proliferation, atomic weaponry in the hands of the United States, colonialism, imperialism, and war. The movement advocated something called positive peace, which meant it's not just the absence of war, it's also the presence of social justice. These activists argued that a nation that could not guarantee a safe life for Americans would never be at peace. The government in response attempted to effectively criminalize advocacy of communism and silence radicals. Charisse Burton-Stelly argues that anti-communism is a Cold War technology that was used to discredit, repress, and criminalize peace activism, and it targeted Black radicals and their white allies. Gerald Horne, who's pictured here, argues that the federal government made minimal concessions to the civil rights movement. So integration is not actually a very radical call, but he argues that they made these minimal concessions and essentially avoided conversations about economic equality, for example. They shut down the movement's vocal and radical allies like communists. This critical and radical perspective was removed, preventing the American left from becoming an important voice in criticizing American capitalism. The mainstream civil rights movement could push for Black Americans to eat at a lunch counter, but those same Black Americans might, quote unquote, lack the wherewithal to buy a hamburger. Robbie Lieberman, a historian, defines Red Scares as attacks on civil liberties in the name of Americanism. Other historians, Ellen Schrecker and Nick Fisher, argue that there were not 2 Red Scares as we usually think about, but several operating since the end of the Civil War to suppress an unruly underclass of people, specifically Black Americans and people organizing in labor unions. Anti-feminists used anti-communism against women's rights activists, and it was used against homosexuals who were seen as deviant from the nuclear family and thus vulnerable to Soviets. So I argue in this particular chapter of my project that anti-communism has been and remains a strain in American political culture to the detriment of civil liberties and the free exercise of constitutional rights. American anti-communism has operated in tandem with restrictive and racist immigration legislation. Anti-communists frequently associated radical politics with immigrants, seeing it as a foreign specter imported along with unwanted immigrant groups. Immigration and anti-radical legislation controlled who had access to citizenship, who could be expelled or segregated or imprisoned, and who could exercise constitutional rights. The Constitution and the Bill of Rights have been inconsistently applied to social justice advocates, immigrants, people of color, and radicals. The Constitution and the rights guaranteed within have proven malleable. Restrictive immigration legislation operated with anti-communist laws to define citizenship and control access to rights for both the foreign and native born. So over time, throughout the period after the Civil War, definitions of un-Americanism could include people who challenged gender roles, homosexuals, people who organized in unions or challenged any kind of corporate power, people making demands for civil rights, and just being a radical. So one of the things that we have to consider is that anti-communism has its roots, anti-communist laws have their roots in American empire. Some of the first laws opposed to communism and radicals came out of the Philippine colonial government. So when the United States had the Philippines as a colony. These laws, ordinances, and policing efforts worked in tandem with immigration restriction to define citizenship as white and subordinate to state control and censorship. So in 1901, the sedition law was passed in the Philippines. The colonial administrators pushed through legislation to crush Native resistance. The 1903 Reconcentration Act authorized mass incarceration, essentially using concentration camps in the Philippines. The 1904 Philippine Libel Law used the language making it illegal for quote unquote public hatred, contempt, or ridicule of the colonial regime. And that language will be used in other American legislation here in the United States. These laws, like the 1903 Immigration or Anarchist Exclusion Act, which was passed in the wake of the assassination of McKinley, barred anyone who advocated or associated with organizations that sought the forcible overthrow of the US government. The 1907 Immigration Act included a provision that an American woman would lose her citizenship if she married a foreign national. That does not get repealed until 1923. In 1908, legislation was passed that allowed for the political censorship of the mail. The declaration of war that brought the United States into World War I allowed for telegraphic and telephonic surveillance. You might be familiar with the 1917 Espionage Act, which gave the government authority to censor information. That same year, the Trading and Enemy Act allowed censorship of mail. You might also be familiar with the 1918 Sedition Act, which made it illegal to denounce the war effort. And then in 1918, the Dillingham-Hardwick Act allowed the deportation of radicals. If you're at all familiar with Emma Goldman, she was actually deported under that law. I'm going to kind of jump ahead in history. I don't want to give you the impression that nothing happened between 1918 and 1940, but the most significant piece of legislation that passed in this period is the 1938 Foreign Registration Act that required organizations or individuals to register as a foreign agent. We get a smattering of laws in the Cold War period as well. The most important happened actually right before US involvement in World War II, the 1940 Smith Act, which made it illegal to advocate or belong to a group advocating the violent overthrow of the US government. It also required alien registration. If you're not familiar with it, alien is how we used to refer to immigrants. And that law was at first aimed towards labor unions because of the fear that labor unions could basically cripple US mobilization for World War II. In 1950, we get the Internal Security Act, also called the McCarran Act, which created the Subversive Activity Control Board, which strengthened the deportation ability of the government. And Section 6 of this act was used to deny Americans passports. In 1952, the Mccarran Walter Act. This act is very interesting. It's got a mixed legacy. It actually lifted the US bar on Chinese immigration, for example. It allowed more immigration from Asia. It allowed for more immigration from Northern Europe. It did, however, limit immigration from the Caribbean to 100 individuals per year. And it also specifically said that immigrants who were communists could be deported. In 1954, the Communist Control Act was passed, which effectively outlawed the Communist Party, preventing it from opening bank accounts, putting candidates on ballots, etc. If you're familiar with Hubert Humphrey, he's the one that pushed it through. He will become Lyndon Johnson's vice president, but he pushed it through so that the Democrats didn't look soft on communism. Chunks of that will be ruled unconstitutional eventually. So immigration restriction and anti-communist legislation serve to define and delimit the citizenship rights of immigrants and, by extension, native-born people of color. US law coupled radicalism and immigration to preserve a white supremacist government and ensure an empowered white citizenry, both by excluding immigrants and by limiting the full expression of citizenship exclusively to white men. Cold War anti-communism was undemocratic, but was depicted as the preservation of democracy. Restrictions on Black Americans were accepted as a method to control a criminal radical element. So what I want to do now is talk about a few specific cases, a few specific examples of the expressions of this control over individuals who were, some were communist, some were not. All right, so Claudia Jones. She was born in Trinidad, came to the United States when she was 8 years old. She is a Communist Party member, so she joins the Communist Party in 1936, and she became an influential member of the party and an influential thinker in the party. She's going to capture the attention of the FBI in 1942. So the FBI officially opens its file on her. I do want to say that the source material I use for this presentation and for this chapter are FBI files. I say that specifically to some of my students in the audience because they know I talk a lot about my use of FBI files. So Claudia Jones's FBI file opens in 1942. A lot of FBI files open in 1942 for various reasons. I won't go into detail now. It takes the FBI about 5 years to realize she is not a citizen. Part of it is because she goes under the pen name Claudia Jones. Her actual name is Claudia Cumberbatch. She had married, so her married name was Claudia Sholnick. They actually found her Social Security number, but this might interest you all. Social Security numbers weren't universal identifiers at this point. They were only about 7 years old. And so they couldn't discover who she was until 1947. She did apply for citizenship twice. She was denied on both occasions because she listed her employer as the Communist Party. The second time she applied, she had just married an American citizen. She's going to be arrested in 1948 under that 1918 Dillingham-Hardwick law that I already mentioned. And then she's going to be detained for deportation in 1950. The deportation order will be canceled and she'll be arrested again in 1951 under the Smith Act. The reasoning being under the Smith Act, they can now basically accuse her of a crime. Presumably because she could not be charged with crime beforehand, just that she was a radical. Evidence of her knowledge of a conspiracy against the federal government were articles she wrote on Black equality. She denounced the military conscription bill that was being debated in Congress at the time, and she denounced the Korean War. Her FBI file, so FBI agents actually noted that she focused primarily on women's and Black equality. She was convicted, sentenced to prison, then deported to England after her release. We can talk about this more in detail during the discussion period on this, but usually the government's case hinged on the writings of Marxist-Leninists and on their own writing. So in the government case against her, they used her own writing. The accusation is that she advocated the violent overthrow of the United States government under the Smith Act, and how the government proved that case is sketchy, and we can talk about it later. But in 1957, most of the convictions under the Smith Act will be vacated because they are ruled unconstitutional. All right, the Sojourners for Truth and Justice. This is an organization that was created in 1951. This organization was a group of Black women who advocated for an anti-lynching bill. They advocated the end of segregation. They advocated the end of disenfranchisement of Black voters. They denounced the Korean War. They denounced American foreign policy that basically pit the US against the Soviet Union. This case is very interesting. You can follow again in their FBI file. The organization comes together. They make a call for Black women to meet in Washington for a march on Washington to call for the end of the Korean War and for Black equality. Within 3 weeks of announcing they were going to march on Washington, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Secret Service, and military intelligence began monitoring them. Military intelligence, by the way, is within the US Army. Military intelligence was basically where US intelligence was originally gathered before we had an FBI. And of course, the CIA is not founded until 1947. So they had 3 organizations already monitoring them within 3 weeks of the organization starting. And then later naval intelligence is also going to start surveillance on them as well. An informant by the name of Julia Clarice Brown claimed that communists were taking over the group, which I find to be an interesting claim given that the group was founded by mostly communists. One informant claimed the group was going to start a revolution. That claim was even doubted by the FBI. The group was only active until 1952, but the Bureau monitored its main leader, who you can see here, and I'm going to talk more about her in a moment, Carlotta Bass, until 1956. They made pretext calls to Carlotta Bass until 1956 to check on her, even though at the time she was elderly and bedridden with a severe case of arthritis. A pretext call is calling someone under the pretext of something else. So say I called you as a representative from the phone company. I tried to get information from you about, say, who your employer is. All right, Carlotta Bass, her FBI file was not released to me by the FBI. One of the issues with using FBI files as sources is that the FBI is hesitant to release their files. Some of these have been processed in the past and thus were made available. Some of them I found online because other people shared them. The FBI does have a reading vault where you can search for people's FBI files. So if you're interested, for example, in Martin Luther King's FBI file, the entire thing is available online. Malcolm X's is available online, Claudia Jones's. Carlotta Bass's file is about 250 pages, but only 50 pages are now available through the FBI vault is what it's called. So I actually got this from someone who had gotten her file years ago. Her file started in 1944. Carlotta Bass was editor of the California Eagle, which is a Black newspaper that started in Los Angeles. She is not a Communist Party member. She never joined the Communist Party. A guy named Louis Budens, who was the editor of the Communist Party's Daily Worker, claimed that Carlotta Bass was a secret member of the Communist Party. And so this justified the FBI surveillance of her. His evidence of people being secret members, and Louis Budens basically names about 200 people as secret members of the Communist Party. His evidence was things like they showed up to a protest or their name was on the letterhead of an organization. The CIA followed her overseas travel. She was ordered to surrender her passport, but she actually refused. This is an image from her file, and if you look at it here, the text says, the subject, a Negro, is the owner, editor, and publisher of the California Eagle, weekly Negro newspaper published in LA. She follows the Communist Party line, advocating abolition of the poll tax. If you're not aware, the poll tax basically taxed people to be able to vote. She advocated the immediate opening of the Second Front. So this is 1944. The opening of the Second Front was essentially urging England and the US to invade Western Europe, which they don't do until June 1944, right? D-Day. And the abolition of Jim Crow. So the reason I have this up here is because I want you to note that according to the FBI, the communist line is advocating the end of poll taxes, the abolition of Jim Crow, and immediate opening of a Second Front. So, all right. Shirley Graham Du Bois is the second wife of W.E.B. Du Bois. I suspect many of you have heard that name. She is also accused of being a secret member by Louis Budens. She is going to end up having a longer FBI file than W.E.B. Du Bois. She is accused of being a Communist Party member. She is never a member, okay? Between 1949 and 1958, her passport will be denied. And this is, of course, an image of her passport. This is something that was allowed under the Mccarran Act. In 1958, the Kent versus Dulles Supreme Court decision ruled that the Secretary of State did not have the discretion to deny a passport because of alleged or actual membership in the Communist Party. At the time, by the way, passports were only issued every 3 years. And now they're every 10 years, right? And before that, it was essentially you usually got a passport the same way you get a visa today, where you had to get each individual trip decided on. And before that, nobody used passports. Shirley Graham Du Bois and W.E.B. Du Bois, because they had their passports denied, will be deported from Canada in 1952 because they traveled there to attend a peace meeting. If you're thinking, well, Canada, they're just our neighbors, that's something that passports weren't generally used to go to Canada at that time. They're not really used until September 11th attacks in 2001. And so they had their passports seized, and they were not even allowed to travel to Canada. So for about 10 years, she was confined to the United States. All right, Islanda Robeson, you might know her husband, Paul Robeson. He's pictured here. Paul Robeson was an All-American football player at Rutgers University. He trains to be a lawyer. He's discriminated against at legal firms. And so rather than stay in law, he becomes a famous actor, and he has a very popular singing voice. So he basically becomes this huge entertainer. Islanda Robeson is his wife. The FBI described her as unfriendly, evasive, and uncooperative. She also is not a Communist Party member, but Louis Budens will accuse her of being a secret member, and he also accuses Paul Robeson of being a secret member. In 1953, she's ordered before the House Un-American Activities Committee. HUAC is probably the committee you're familiar with. You probably learned about it in school. That and Joseph McCarthy are usually the two things people learn about with the Cold War. Joseph McCarthy was not associated with the House Un-American Activities Committee. He was a senator, so he's associated with the Tidings Committee in the Senate. The House Un-American Activities Committee generally focused on entertainers. They focused on individuals that, for example, like Islanda Robeson, who was an author, and many of her books were housed in embassies overseas, in the libraries and embassies overseas. The Tidings Committee generally focused on people that were suspected of being communists in government. So there's a pretty big difference there. HUAC also, by the way, was interested in labor unions, and one of the House committees came here to Evansville in 1948. Generally, before a committee, people would invoke the Fifth Amendment, which of course is your right not to incriminate yourself. She did not invoke the 15th Amendment. Instead, she invoked she didn't invoke the Fifth Amendment, she invoked the 15th Amendment, which was passed during Reconstruction, which gave citizens the right to vote despite race. Her argument was that the committee was violating her rights as a citizen. She forced the committee to acknowledge it was violating her rights, but she also will have her passport denied. The fact that her husband also has his passport denied for, again, about 10 years means that this is going to seriously curtail his career, because his career was about traveling overseas. He was in plays in London and all over the world. And so this is going to really hurt their livelihood. Louise Thompson Patterson is the only other person that I'm talking about today that was actually a Communist Party member. The surveillance on Louise Thompson Patterson lasted 33 years. She was recommended for something called custodial detention under the security index. Now, all of the women I'm talking about today are going to be on the custodial detention list. This list was a sort of pet project of J. Edgar Hoover, and it listed people that should be detained during a national emergency. Now, he came up with this list starting in 1939, and it was called the Custodial Detention Index. He's forced to rename it the Security Index because it's a less loaded term. And he was also forced to concede that he couldn't detain American citizens without actually accusing them of a crime. That means, though, however, immigrants could be detained without being accused of a crime. Her crimes, quote unquote, included affiliation with organizations like the Civil Rights Congress, the Council on African Affairs, the International Workers' Order, and the Congress of American Women. And her denunciation of the Korean War was also included in her file. Patterson worked for the International Workers Order, which was basically like an insurance agency. And the New York State Assembly wanted to get rid of the International Workers Order. It was associated with radicals. She was called to testify, and all they wanted her to do was to plead the Fifth Amendment, because effectively they saw pleading the Fifth Amendment as an admission of guilt and Communist Party membership. She went before the New York committee and she pled the Fifth, and they saw it as evidence of guilt, and the IWO had its right to operate withdrawn in the state of New York. Beulah Richardson, also not a Communist Party member, was close friends with the Pattersons, Louise Thompson Patterson and her husband, William Patterson. In her file, the FBI was pretty confused. The FBI thought she was Carlotta Bass. So let me just go back to the picture of Carlotta Bass. They thought that Beulah Richardson was that woman in the center here. Okay, so it took them a while to realize she's not Carlotta Bass, who, by the way, was also 20 years older than Beulah Richardson at the time. So it took them a little while to figure that out. They claimed that Beulah Richardson, based on an informer's information, was a member of the Communist Party in California starting in 1946. However, she didn't move to California until 1948. In 1951, she writes a poem called "A Black Woman Speaks of White Womanhood, of White Supremacy, and of Peace." This poem is going to actually inspire the founding of the Sojourners for Truth and Justice, and she is one of the co-founders. So that's the organization I told you about before. So the FBI opened its file on her around the time of the founding of the Sojourners. Now, association was considered a crime. Association essentially meaning, you know, are you associating with communists? Are you associating with organizations that have communists? So membership in the Communist Party was not necessary. She was friends with the Pattersons. She was friends with Claudia Jones and with Carlotta Bass. She was also a member of the Sojourners for Truth and Justice. That was really enough evidence for the FBI to put her on its security index, and she remained under surveillance until 1972. But she becomes a stage and screen star, and you may be familiar with her and you don't even know it. She was in the television show Sanford and Sons. She was also in the show ER. Some of you may be too young for these references. She's also in the movie Beloved, which was the adaptation of the Toni Morrison book Beloved. She's a Tony and Oscar Award nominee. She won an Emmy. By the 1950s and 1960s, anti-communism was a little less popular, and in 1954, Joseph McCarthy is censored. So the Bureau kept monitoring her, and it kept doing those pretext calls, again, calling her under a pretext to get information. But the FBI did not question her, so they didn't bring her in for questioning for fear of embarrassment. The next person, I hope you know her, Lorraine Hansberry, is also going to be associated with all of these women I've been talking about. I assume many of you know her as the author of A Raisin in the Sun. She is also going to be a big name civil rights activist. She briefly joined the Communist Party in the late 1940s when she was a college student, but she does not remain a Communist Party member. She was concerned about war and the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of World War II. So a lot of Black Americans were opposed to the use of nuclear weapons, primarily because the bomb has never, to this point, been used by another power, but it's only ever been used against a nation of color. And so Black Americans saw it as a tool against other nations of color. So again, association was important. She was friends with communists. She was friends with the Pattersons. She was roommates with Claudia Jones at one point. She's going to be active in the Sojourners for Truth and Justice. She writes for Paul Robeson's newspaper, Freedom Ways. In 1952, she attends a peace conference in Montevideo in Paul Robeson's place because Paul Robeson's passport, remember, was seized and he could not travel. And she went to this conference in his place and read a statement by him. And this is going to increase the FBI's interest in her. She will be put on Hoover's security index as a national security threat, and her passport will also be taken away. It's interesting, in the FBI file, one of the agents actually writes, well, she doesn't seem like much of a threat, so we'll just take her off the security index. And J. Edgar Hoover writes back, nope, we're putting her back on the security index. She was monitored, she's followed, and her house was watched. A Raisin in the Sun became a success in 1959, and this made it embarrassing for the FBI to question her. So the same thing with Beulah Richardson. Lorraine Hansberry won't be questioned because the FBI didn't want to be embarrassed by it. A Raisin in the Sun, when it first debuted, an FBI agent actually went to view it to see if it was communist influenced. And they decided that there wasn't a communist influence in it. I actually did write a blog on this for that site that Quentin mentioned, Black Perspectives, if you're interested in it. She does not get removed from the security index until 1965, when she died unexpectedly of cancer at the age of 34. Okay, so there were, of course, white communists who were arrested, imprisoned, and deported. But each of them were anti-racist advocates vocally opposed to imperialism and colonialism. They were some of the most vehement and loyal allies of Black Americans. And they stood side by side with their Black colleagues when few progressive organizations did, to demand justice. The price of anti-communism has been immense. Discussions about the toll of capitalism on humans and the environment are silenced with accusations of socialism and communism. This reductive reasoning has convinced many Americans that civil rights is a communist conspiracy directed against the right of white Americans. And anti-communism is bound up with white supremacy and remains a potent tool in a violently racist country. I do want to take some time, so it looks like I made pretty good time. I have been collecting what I call anti-communist artifacts, and these are things that come up recently. If you pay any attention to the news, accusations of socialism and communism are bandied about pretty much regularly. And so I've been collecting these artifacts that are very recent. So I want to share some of them with you. This was one that went out with a fundraising email. Basically, the official 2021 Republican platform survey, which do you identify? And there's only two choices. Are you a Republican or are you a socialist? Wendy Rogers, if you're not familiar with her, she is a big name in right-wing conservative circles. She is an Arizona state legislature. She was recently outed as a member of the Oath Keepers. Her name was listed with that, if you paid attention to the news, I think it was 2 weeks ago, the Oath Keepers membership list was leaked to the press. She's always got some really great, interesting stuff that she tweets about. So this one, I stand with Jesus, Robert E. Lee, and the Cleveland Indians, all being canceled by the satanic communists, but they can never cancel Jesus. He will have the last word. He is the word. This is my favorite one of hers. She accused Big Bird of being a communist because Big Bird advocated being vaccinated. This one I call grammatically painful. It's a bumper sticker. I still hate communists, even though they started calling themselves liberals. This one is a conversation which demonstrates that these folks are not only confused on what communism is, but they're also confused on what capitalism is. So does anybody have a list of all the big corporations with Marxist views? I want to make sure I avoid them. They all do, sadly. It seems we have no choice left but to abolish private corporations. It's the only way to defeat Marxism. I think you're right. If I have to explain this to you, I think you might need to read, maybe some John Locke, maybe some Marx yourself, but they're clearly a little confused on what both capitalism and communism are. This is another one that's my favorite. It's a comment on an article, How Long Sex Should Last According to a Study. And the comment is, a 2-minute intercourse is more than enough for the husband to inseminate his wife. More than that is vice, perversion, and socialism. This is Marjorie Taylor Greene. This is anti-vax, of course, calling vaccinations communist. Somewhat recently, a sheriff in Missouri discussed killing communists. Some of the January 6th rioters were citing their fear of communism as the reason why they attacked the Capitol. So a New York Times article in January, that should say 2022, Mr. Zink, a one-time church deacon, referenced the biblical book of Proverbs as he outlined why he believed COVID-19 was a bioweapon meant to convert the United States to socialism. Several people who marched on the Capitol described the day as a kind of Trumpian Fort Sumter, part of a life or death fight against socialism, anti-Christian secularism, and the tyranny of President Biden's masking and vaccine mandates. There was a man who started sending out threats to Georgia election officials, offering $10,000 to kill them. And he was quoted as saying, quote, "It's time to put a bullet into certain officials because it's our duty as American patriots to put an end to the lives of these traitors and take back our country by force. We're going to make examples of traitors to our country. Death to you and your communist friends." None of this is new. This is something that we can trace throughout the 20th century and in the period after the Civil War. And just a couple more examples, and then I'll open up to questions. This is an example of a Ku Klux Klan pamphlet from the post-Brown versus Board of Education period after 1954. So Negroes beware, do not attend communist meetings. And what they mean, of course, are the NAACP. They're talking about the NAACP as communist. This is a good example of how being accused of being socialist really doesn't necessarily have to be partisan. Dwight Eisenhower's interstate highway plan was accused of being creeping socialism. And if you're at all familiar with the John Birch Society, its founder, Robert Welch, famously accused Dwight Eisenhower of being an agent of communists. And then this is a recent political cartoon, so from 2019, that listed the other things that have been accused of being communist in the past, like the Federal Aid Highway Act, the public parks of 1905, public schools, pretty much the entire New Deal, but especially the 1935 Social Security Act and the 1965 Medicare Act. I'm going to go ahead and stop there, and we can open up to questions if anyone has any questions. I don't know, Quentin, if you wanted to field these or you want me to do it?
Yeah, I'll read them to you. So we had one, let me go closer to my screen than I thought. Someone asked, what is the second front? Like the second front of a war, or was there some other meaning for that?
Oh no, so if you think about Western Europe and World War II, the Soviets were fighting the Nazis in Eastern Europe, and then the hope was to open a second front in Western Europe to split the Nazi forces. So that's the second front. It's basically what the United States does on D-Day when it invades northern France, right? So that's the second front.
All right, the next question is, can you tell us more about your process for collecting the recent artifacts, like the ones you showed from social media, etc.? How do you find those?
Yeah, so actually I started finding them on accident, and that's what prompted me to start finding them. It's not hard to find them these days. There's a lot of conversation in the media, especially with Trump, because Trump accuses a lot of people. Anyone who disagrees with him is, a communist. And so it wasn't too hard to find them. I rarely had to seek them out, but if you actually go to Twitter and put in the trending topics and you look up socialism or communism, there's tons. There's always tons. But normally I just let them come to me because they're just very easy to find. I've taken pictures of people's bumper stickers here in Evansville. There's some here too, so.
All right, the next question says, have you been able to assess the reliability of FBI files during the Hoover regime, given his reputation for collecting blackmail to perpetrate his position as director?
Yeah, fantastic question. And I actually talk to my students about this a lot because FBI files are a really great example of problematic historical sources. The way that I use FBI files is as an indication of the Bureau and not the people that are under surveillance, right? Because the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover have their own prejudices. And they are essentially, as I showed with that image from the FBI file, from Carlotta Bass's file, they consider anyone who's advocating civil rights to be a communist, right? And so FBI files are just a really good way to understand the Bureau and not the people under surveillance per se, right? And so, and yeah, J. Edgar Hoover did collect a lot to blackmail people. There's not a lot of that in the files that I use, because these are just surveillance files. One of the problems with FBI files, and again, this is about historical process, is getting access to them. There have been 2 files that I have not been able to fully get, although I managed to get them because they were released years before. And then other files that I've only been able to get pieces of, and then some that have just downright been denied to me. The special agent in charge, SAC, is something you see frequently throughout these. They were doing these special reports on the surveillance of communists, basically from the late 30s until the 1950s. And those files have never been released. And so there's a lot in there that I would like to know. Now, Tracy's question, of course, is like, do I find anything on the blackmail? Not really. I mean, the people that I'm dealing with are not being blackmailed, they're being surveilled. But that kind of stuff is definitely in some of those files.
All right, the next question/comment says, I vividly remember 3 questions during my green card interview, which took place in the 80s. 1, have you ever prostituted yourself? 2, are you a drug addict? And 3, have you ever belonged to the Socialist and or Communist Party? If I had confirmed my party membership, what would have happened? And are immigrant Social Security numbers identifiable?
That is another great question. And I actually put in, so a FOIA request, Freedom of Information Act. I put in a Freedom of Information Act request with the Immigration and Naturalization Services for data on that question, because someone that I know who just got their citizenship in 2020 had to answer that question. So that question still exists. Are you a communist? I don't know about the prostitution question. That's also super interesting, and the drug use question. But the are you a socialist or a communist question does still exist on naturalization papers today. And so I did put in a FOIA request, and I have not gotten those documents. The problem with Freedom of Information Act requests is sometimes you're just outright denied access. The other problem is if it's not something that's already been processed, they will take years to actually process that documentation because they don't want to release information that they claim might be potentially endangering national security. So, the redactions in FBI files are pretty common, and that's what they mean by processing it. So good question. I don't have the answer to it. If I ever do get the answer to it, I'll let you know.
All right. The next question is, are anarchists also persecuted with the anti-communist laws or any other political ideology?
So Emma Goldman, who I mentioned was deported, was an anarchist. The only other anarchist that I study is Carlo Tresca. He's a super interesting dude. The FBI followed him throughout his life. There's a period in which the FBI in the 1920s was ordered not to surveil political radicals. And so they sort of didn't. Hoover was still collecting some information, but not as detailed. So Carlo Tresca was an anarchist. So there's a big gap in his file where he's not being monitored. And then he will very famously be assassinated in 1943. So obviously his file ends at that point. But yes, the FBI file does go after anarchists. That's actually a question that was on the laws that I mentioned before, like the 1918 Dillingham-Hardwick Act and the 1903 Act. Both of them named anarchists. It's not really until the 1950s where they say communists specifically can be deported. So it's originally anarchists. So, sorry, I made a short answer too long, but yes.
All right, the next question is, have you been able to gain access to any of the files from military intelligence or the ONI?
No, no, I haven't. The process for Freedom of Information Act is convoluted, and It's just difficult to get these documents. So I haven't gotten any of them. I've also tried to get New York State Police Department files as well, because they did some of their own monitoring and they won't release anything to me either. It's these Freedom of Information Act requests, and in New York, it's the Freedom of Information legislation, so it's FOIL. And I say New York because that's where a lot of people that I study lived. There's a lot of information that's not available and records that they don't want to make available. I'm not trying to be a conspiracy theorist. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I do think that there has been some hesitance on the part of law enforcement to release some of this information because it's going to make them look bad. And the FBI has been under a lot of scrutiny recently because of the fact that they failed over the years to follow right-wing organizations, right-wing terrorist organizations. That's why they keep coming up short in a lot of these cases. And so they've come under scrutiny because of that. And their focus has traditionally been on left-wing organizations. It's not to say they didn't focus on like the Ku Klux Klan, but they put a lot more energy into left-wing groups. And so I suspect some of this hesitance to release intelligence files is trying to just protect their image, I guess.
All right. Someone is asking, what do you think people mean when they use the term communist? Many of the examples and people you presented often have very little to do with socialism or communism.
I think they're using it to describe anything they disagree with. I think that's about it. I don't, and you see this in the past as well. So of the women that I mentioned today, only 2 of them were official Communist Party members when they were under surveillance. The others were associated with communists, they were friends with communists, and they were civil rights activists. And nevertheless, they were called communists and socialists. So I think those 2 words have been used as a catch-all to basically describe literally anything that you oppose.
Why do you think anti-communism is still a powerful tool today in the US when communism has declined around the world?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's just because it has political liability, right? It's just a way to frame things that that you oppose. So there's a lot behind this, and I could go on for an entire semester, and I have, right, about this issue. But anti-communism serves particular interests. It serves corporate interests, for example, who don't want to be confronted with the things they are doing in the name of profit, like destroying the environment or exploiting their workers or preventing unionization or any number of things, right? And so it has a lot of power for that because it discredits people if you accuse them of being communist. In the past, not recently, not that I know of anyway, in the past, people have lost jobs because they were associated with communism. UE, the University of Evansville, fired a professor in 1948 because he wasn't a communist, by the way, but he went on stage for a candidate who also wasn't a communist, but was supported by the Communist Party. So it's just a tool to silence dissent, I think, is the simplest answer.
I believe you mentioned that one person you studied pleaded the 15th Amendment in a committee hearing. I know the Hollywood Nine tried to plead the First Amendment before the HUAC to no avail, but could you please explain how the person mentioned pleaded the 15th Amendment?
Yeah, so, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, there was one other word, it was amendment.
Oh, yeah. So as Londa Robeson, she pled the 15th Amendment. Essentially, what she tried to do was bring before the House Un-American Activities Committee the issue of the disenfranchisement of Black Americans. I didn't get into it in this talk, but all of these women, and part of my book project is their opposition to the Korean War. In fact, that's the focus of the book project. And one of the things that they argue is that the United States could hardly call itself an institution and a nation who could defend democracy abroad when there were people within the United States that could not exercise the rights of democracy, right? Like voting. And so she was using it symbolically to say, hey, look, you have given us the right to vote, and yet there are Black Americans across the country that don't have the right to vote. So this is a direct violation of my citizenship rights. How can you put me on trial when you're not even letting me be represented, right? And yes, as Tracy mentioned, the First Amendment is used by the Hollywood Nine, who are accused of communist propaganda. And basically, they use the First Amendment to say, hey, we have the right to freedom of speech. Effectively, what all of these people are doing are trying to say, you're violating the Constitution, you're violating my constitutional rights. And so that pleading the First, the Fifth, or the 15th is dramatizing that to a larger audience. The House Un-American Activities Committee hearings, some of them will later be televised. And this is something that historians have often argued. The long 60s thesis essentially disenfranchised so many people who will be involved in the civil rights, the New Left, Black Power movement, women's liberation movement in the 60s and 70s, because they watched all of these people be dragged before the House committee and have their constitutional rights violated.
Right. So we have a few more questions, and I apologize to those who sent it, but I want to be mindful of everyone's time. It is 3:57 and we have until 4. Would you like to answer another question, or?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say there's a few. I'll just pick one. How about that?
Sure.
When did the Communist Party become legal after it was outlawed? With the rise of the far-right movement here in the United States, do you think there's a possibility it could be outlawed again at some point?
So officially, it was never exactly outlawed, because that would be an admission that you're violating someone's First Amendment. That Communist Control Act in 1954 tried to limit its rights as an organization, effectively making it illegal, but it couldn't make it illegal. So the Communist Party was never officially illegal. It was just hampered in its operations. And of course, so many of its leaders and members were being put on trial that also was going to hurt its operations. To make a party illegal would be the height of anti-democracy, right? If we keep heading towards this minority-majority rule that some parties are pushing for, right, to disenfranchise people so that they don't get to choose the political party in power, if we keep moving towards that, could parties be made illegal? I hope not, because then we'd be in a lot of trouble if that's what actually happens. Could it happen? It's happened in the past. So sure, anything's possible.
I think that's a great place to end it. Anything's possible, right?
Yeah, on that sad note.
Well, Dr. Lynn, thank you so much for leading this interesting presentation and discussion. Everyone else who's here, thank you for attending and participating in it. And with that, today's session is officially over. Thank you all for attending, and we look forward to seeing you at the next faculty colloquium. Have a wonderful day. Happy Friday.